Welcome back to Full-Time Yoga Teacher Podcast. My name is Reika and I am your host. If you are a new listener, welcome to Full-Time Yoga Teacher Podcast. If you are a returning listener, welcome back. I'm so happy you are here. In this Full-Time Yoga Teacher Podcast, I get to interview amazing full-time yoga teachers across the world to see how they are making their career work. How are they making their passion and even spirituality practice into something that they do as a full-time offering, how they pay the bill, and also how do they stay connected and in alignment. So I hope you're enjoying all the amazing conversation I've been having with other full-time yoga teachers across the world. I want to make this intro quick this week. So I started a short mini-series on intentional sequencing with Karen last week. So last week was the number one of this mini-series where we talked about how do we prepare the body for intentional anatomy-informed sequencing. This week, we're talking about doing too much or maybe cueing too much or just kind of jumbling up a sequence together that doesn't really make sense. I think we all have done that before. I still sometimes do that to this day. So we're going to talk about that on this week's podcast episode where Karen and I are talking about sequencing. If you are interested in learning more about sequencing that is intentional, that is anatomy informed and intelligent, Karen is coming to be a guest teacher on my mentorship program for yoga teachers at end of October 25th, which is Saturday from 2 to 4 p.m. Pacific time. And she's going to teach her signature workshop on sequencing. So I'm very excited to have her on, and I'm very excited for everyone to get to learn from her about how can we think about sequencing in a very intentional, anatomy-informed, and intelligent way so you're not just putting random poses together. This workshop is for yoga teachers, and it's open to all and any yoga teachers of all levels to come and join. It will be done in person here in Long Beach, California, but it's also going to be live streamed on Zoom, so you can join from any time zones. It'll also be recorded, so you can watch the recording later if you need. The price of this workshop is sliding scale of $45 to $85, so you get to decide the amount that works for your financial budget. If you have any questions about this workshop, please let me know, but I'll put the link to sign up and learn more about the workshop on the show notes, so please go check that out. Otherwise, let's get started on this week's conversation I had with Karen on sequencing. Welcome back, Karen, to Full-Time Yoga Teacher Podcast. This is episode 2 of the mini-series of sequencing. And on last week's episode, we talked about how can we properly, intentionally warm up student's body and also kind of wind down their body in our sequencing. And this week, we're back to talk about doing too much. So tell us a little bit about what do you mean maybe doing too much in a sequencing setting?
Well, I think it's funny because I feel like I always talk about myself when I was a newer teacher, because when you're new, you're figuring everything out, right? And a lot of that comes from your own learning. I feel like in a lot of 200-hour teacher trainings, and this is why I think it's so important that you offer your mentorship. Once you get out of a 200-hour teacher training, you're just out in the yoga world without a lot of support or help. And it's very easy to into maybe seeing what other people are doing or listening too much to other people's opinions about what you should be doing as a teacher. And it can be kind of easy to fall into this idea of, in particular with sequencing, things having to be super creative or needing to put so much into one class in order to prove ourselves. And I think that that's really common when you're a newer teacher, especially if you go into a space where there's more seasoned teachers. You almost end up operating from this place of, for lack of a better word, insecurity, because you feel like you have to prove yourself in that way. And then your sequences end up being very complicated, which makes it hard for you then as a teacher to keep sequencing like that. And then it just causes a lot of stress and anxiety as well.
And I think I remember when I first became a teacher, I started working at a studio that had a very specific way of teaching vinyasa that was very different than what my teacher training taught me. My teacher training didn't really teach me how to do this 3 rounds of flow in vinyasa class. I think it's also called ladder flow. And the studio I started working at, that was a very common way teachers taught was 3 rounds. So I remember switching my teaching sequence or switching my sequencing to fit that studio's culture of 3 rounds. And eventually I kind of came back to teaching in a way that was taught in my 200 and 300 hours. But I remember feeling the peer pressure that I have to teach in 3 rounds format. And also I have to keep being quote unquote creative in my sequencing to kind of keep it interesting. That's the pressure I felt, whether that was true pressure or not. But I remember really kind of,
Self-imposed pressure.
yeah, exactly. Could be a self imposed pressure. But definitely remember, like, I have to do it in a way that was popular in a studio.
I think I also used to be very married to that idea of sequencing. And I think it has its positives, right? It gives people this chance, at least during that time, I enjoyed teaching it. And I still see reasons for people wanting to teach that way, right? I'm not saying you have to sequence one specific way,
Hmm.
but it was nice because I would go through it slow. And then it would give people an opportunity to do it again and plus add other things on. But I think what happens is it gets very limited because you can only put certain poses together that flow into one another, right? Because as we're building these 3 rounds, we're flowing quote unquote breath to movement in vinyasa style. But like we talked about in the first episode, vinyasa doesn't mean breath to movement. It means to
Hmm.
place in a special way. So within that were ways that I could get really creative as far as offering things, but then you're also very stuck in the way that you put poses together and the way that you have to start thinking about things. And I think that's for me where I started to get very anxious in planning because
Hmm.
then every week I felt like I had to keep sort of upping the level of
Hmm.
becoming more creative when I was stuck in this one specific way of
Hmm.
sequencing.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It can feel limited if that's the only way you feel like you can sequence. And another thing I noticed with that 3 rounds way or method of teaching vinyasa was that because you're doing 3 rounds of similar-ish sequence, there's so many poses that you have to add on one side and another side. Like it becomes so long that you're on your right side. You just keep adding on, adding on, adding on. And sometimes I feel like that's not the most accessible or maybe safe way to teach is when you keep linking like 10, 20 poses on one side before going on to the other side. And almost you have to do that in 3 rounds method of teaching because otherwise you would have to do like 5 or 6 rounds in 60-minute class.
Too many chaturangas.
Yeah, exactly. But that's also the time that I felt like I was doing too much as a teacher in my sequencing is when I was trying to find all this fun, creative way to connect poses. And I was just throwing in poses in my sequencing just to do it. And there wasn't a lot of thought behind why, rather than just because it was fun to do it one breath, one move.
Yeah, I actually recently, because I have all the way that I personally remember things is I write them down. I write everything down. I have a book, which by the way, if you have a book or notes, I'm for it. I don't care how long you've been teaching. I've been teaching for almost 13 years and I still have a book. It's you can have your book. It's okay. I also have the ability to now go off the sequence that I've planned, right, over time.
Yeah.
But it is nice. I don't consider it a crutch. Sometimes
Mhm.
I'm teaching 3 different formats in a week and my brain just needs a little bit of help. But I went back through and I was just curious. I went back through like an old journal, probably from
Yeah.
maybe when we were teaching together at the other studio in 2018. And I was looking at these things like, why did I even teach that? Or how did I even fit this much in a 1 hour class? And I
Yeah.
really think I don't want to paint this in a negative light because I don't think being ambitious is bad, but it's being too ambitious, right? It comes from this place of needing to prove that we're good enough. And the question that
Mm.
I always come back to is that if we're like we talked about in the first episode, teaching people. We're teachers, right? What is it that we want them to learn, or what are we trying to teach them? And if we're just putting in so much stuff and it becomes so complicated, does it actually serve our students in the long run of teaching? Like, it's really cool in the moment, in the 60 minutes, right? And I think like this is where it gets hard, because it's pretty shiny, fun, it's exciting. People talk about you at the yoga studio like you're the cool, there's all these wild transitions teacher, and there's almost like an addiction to that feeling, that way, that new exciting way that, you know, we can get caught up in our ego as teachers, that I feel like at the end of the day isn't actually what I brought me to teaching and what I actually want to offer, but it's very easy to get there.
Yeah.
Very easy to be tempted to go there. And I don't think being creative or being challenging is wrong, right? I just think that if you're going to be creative, you should still have that intentionality behind it. It should have some sound principle or foundation behind it.
And I like what you said of like, what are you teaching, or what are we teaching? And that keeps coming back for me now when I think about sequencing, is like, what's the focus today or this week, whatever sequence I'm trying to come up with or think about that day or that week. It's like, just narrow it down to one little thing that I'm trying to teach that day, whether that's a movement principle or a specific action or a specific pose or shape. And that helps me narrow down. I don't have to put all the poses I can think of in that one sequence or one class. I can be very selective, and I don't have to do too much. I can really kind of focus every pose, every order of poses. There's a reason why and why we do it, because I know exactly what I'm trying to teach that day. That focus has really helped me narrow and kind of simplify my sequence in a way. And like you said, it's not wrong to be creative. It's not wrong to be hard. But I think it's good to be intentional about, why are you teaching this week? Like, what are you trying to get across that day?
Yeah, because I think when there's so much going on, are we actually giving our students space to come into their bodies, to actually feel what's happening? Because at least for me, in those times where I felt like I need to be really cool and creative, the energy felt very rushed, because I'm trying to get through everything. Because again, it's coming from this place of feeling like I lack, like I'm trying to prove myself as a teacher. So then I personally am not grounded in the moment. And then the sequence doesn't energetically feel grounded to me. And our lives are so complicated. So much is complicated that the beauty in yoga sometimes is simplicity. But that can be difficult to communicate to our students.
Yeah. I love that our lives can be already busy and stressful and complicated already, so we don't really have to make our yoga sequence that way. I've noticed my sequence has gotten simpler and simpler as longer I teach. And also when I see Annie Carpenter, my teacher, her sequence is very, very simple, like there's probably like 10 to 15 poses that she might teach in like 90% of her classes. She might kind of throw in something different in a sequence or in a class a couple times, but like 90% of the poses she teaches are the same poses in almost every class. That's another thing that's beautiful. When you really focus on what you want to teach that day, you can teach a same pose, let's say warrior two, and maybe your focus is hip that day, but then you can have another next week teach the same warrior two, but the focus is on the shoulders that day. So like same pose can be taught in such a different way depending on what your focus is that day. And I think that kind of subtle and nuanced, layered way of teaching it's fun for me.
And for me too, if I do, because I think, we love what we do, right? So I can personally get excited when I start planning something. I'll sit down and I'll write out the sequence. I personally always practice. If I don't know how of course I know the poses, right? I practice most of the poses, but if I'm in particular going to put things together or maybe offer a creative transition, which this can sometimes for newer teachers really stop them up, where they come up with this creative transition, right? And these creative ways to put these poses together. But can you actually teach and use your words to get people from one pose to the next if it's not a simple like warrior one to warrior two?
Mm.
And for me, I often have to sit down and go back still and self-edit and ask, does this really need to be here? Or am I just putting this in to give them something extra because I have people-pleasing tendencies? Because, and it's more complex than that, right? Because we're in a studio where our numbers make us money. Our popularity is so we have to exist in that. And it can be such an interesting, this is for me why I'm doing this self-work of yoga, to figure out how that doesn't manifest in the way that I teach. But yeah, I have to go back and self-edit. I have to be like, Karen, why did you put this here? And if I can't come up with a reason beyond, well, just cause, then I'm like, I could just take it out. I could just do a little bit less. To me, there's always beauty in doing less.
It's very, very true. I love how you said you were looking back at your old sequences from like maybe 5 years ago or 8 years ago. I don't have like a notebook that I keep, but I think it would be so fascinating to look back to my old sequencing. So that must be really cool that you can look back and see how your sequencing have evolved.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because when I first started teaching, it was extremely simple. When you're a new teacher, don't go off the fucking rails. Just keep it simple because you're trying to figure out how to put these poses together, how to teach these poses, how to cue these poses, how to cue breath. And that's where things can get really murky, is when you try to do too much. So when I first started teaching, it was so simple. And then, you kind of ride that wave of, you teach a little while longer and then you see what other people are doing around you and they're doing this and that seems to be popular. And, you start doing that. I started getting into my 3 rounds and then I have moved back down. I still feel like I fit quite a bit in my classes. I'm not out here saying that I teach the most simple vinyasa class, but to me, it almost reflects what happens in practice, where when you're new, you start with simple. And then you go way up, you start chasing all these poses. You need more inversions, more arm balances. And now I'm at the point where I'm like, I don't care if I do. I don't care if I do handstand.
That reminds me of, I don't know where I heard this from, but when you are a new teacher, you feel like you don't know anything. So you feel like, I need to learn more. I need to do more continuing education. I need to do 300 hours. I need to take anatomy class. And then there's a middle stage that comes where you think you know everything. And like, what's wrong, what's right. This is how it should be. But then like longer you start teaching, then more you realize you don't know. And a lot of your answers become, well, it depends. It depends, So I love that progression kind of aligned with what you shared of how your sequencing have evolved. Super interesting. So anything else you want to maybe say or share about this concept of, or maybe common mistake we see of doing too much, maybe adding too many poses in a sequence?
I think if we think about, and I can't remember who I heard say this, maybe it was Jason Crandall, but he was saying something like, your students only absorb 1/3 of what you say to them, right? So I think we're the first ones that get really sick of our own voices and of our own sequencing and of I'm sitting down and thinking about these things all the time and I'm hearing my own voice a lot, but other people aren't intaking that much of the information that you're giving them. And the way that we learn is truly by repetition. So this idea that, we need to say things so differently and have every single class be so unique and do so many things, I feel like doesn't accurately reflect the way that people actually practice or learn how to get better at things. I always tell people, if you think about learning how to play the piano, you have to learn the keys first. And then you play Mary Had a Little Lamb. You don't just sit down at the piano and start playing Beethoven, right? So at least in terms of, I think what it is, my goal as a teacher, which is to help people get more embodied. If things are too complex, I know that's not happening, even for myself in my own practice.
Yeah, definitely. I think we both listen and have respect for Jason Crandall, and he says how like you said, we have to repeat things to actually get good at something. Like when you practice a sport, you have to do the same thing over and over and over until you get good at that thing. And when we put too many poses or too many things in a yoga sequence, maybe you get a chance to do one pose one time in that whole sequence, or maybe three times if you do a 3 rounds thing. But just like one breath, one movement, you're not actually like being in the pose and feeling the pose. And I think there's a magic to slowing it down and really feel the pose, but also having a sequence where we are actually, like you said, learning about ourselves in the pose because we get to sit in that pose. Because we get to do that pose in a way that like we're feeling it. We're being curious about what's happening in our body. And I think sometimes when we go too fast or too many poses, we really don't give ourselves time to feel and learn about the poses, how it feels in our body.
Yeah, we're being present.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like this is a good time to remind yoga teachers that we're not choreographers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's challenging, in particular, when we teach at a studio where perhaps there's more than just yoga being offered, right? When we're in this group class kind of container, because there are certain group classes where the teacher is just there to kind of like put people through the exercises or whatnot and have this cool playlist and have these lights, and that's the experience. I think, and we talked about this in the episode prior, like you were saying, what Annie says is we're here to wake people up. Again, I don't want to say that having people flow breath to movement is not something that's empowering, right? Like maybe someone feeling like they're doing a choreographed dance isn't awesome for them. But at the end of the day, I always have to return to what it is that I want to share about this practice and what benefited me. And I think we can so often just get caught up in that we feel like we need to offer this cool, fun, exciting, hip.
Mm-hmm.
People want to take pictures and post about how hard it was or awesome it was on Instagram. I don't think that that is the heart of yoga. Not that I'm the authority on yoga.
No, I completely agree with you. Oh my God, I used to post on social media the yoga flow of the week that I created, I taught that week, and like it has to look cool on the video, right? But now if I think about my sequencing, like it's gonna be very boring if I posted that on social media. They'd be like, what you do? Extended side angle, half moon. Like it'll be so like it's such so simplified that it's not going to make an exciting social media post at all. But like there's a beauty in really feeling the foundational poses and feeling it and how depending on what you're trying to teach that week, you can feel something completely different in the same pose you did last week because your focus is different.
Yeah, and the boring stuff, I mean, boredom is a feeling like anything else, but I think sometimes the boring stuff and that feeling of being bored can be very beautiful because what does it teach us about ourselves, right? What does my desire to need to have thankfully I've moved on from that, but what is my desire to have a super cool creative class every week tell me about myself?
Mm-hmm.
And learning about myself is part of my yoga practice.
Mm-hmm. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Karen. So anybody listening who would like to learn more about intentional sequencing, Karen's teaching a workshop coming up in Long Beach in person, but you can also join the live stream. It'll be October 25th, Saturday, 2 to 4 p.m. Pacific time. So I'll put the link on the show notes if anybody's interested in signing up for that workshop coming up. I'm very much looking forward to it. And we will be back next week for the final episode of this mini series on sequencing. So thank you so much, Karen.
Thank you, Reika.
Thank you so much for listening to this conversation I had with Karen. This was part 2 of the mini series that Karen and I recorded on the topic of sequencing. If you want to learn more about sequencing, you're in luck because Karen is coming as a guest teacher on my mentorship program for yoga teachers to teach you about sequencing that is intentional, anatomy informed, and intelligent. So if you want to join this workshop, you're welcome to join even if you're not part of my mentorship program. So to join, just click the link on my show notes. The workshop is happening October 25th, 2025. It's Saturday, 2 to 4 p.m. Pacific time. And it'll be in person here in Long Beach, but it's also going to be live streamed for anybody joining from another time zone, state, or country. It's also going to be recorded if you want to watch the recording later. But to get the full thing, if you live nearby, I really highly encourage you to show up in person. That's always the best if you can make that happen. The workshop is $45 to $85 sliding scale. You get to decide the amount that works for you. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me or Karen and find out. You can also click the link on my bio to learn more. I hope you can join us for this workshop. I'm really looking forward to be learning alongside you. Otherwise, if you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with somebody you know or yoga teacher, friends that you have, or yoga teacher of yours that you want to share it to. And rating, subscribing, downloading, starring, anything you can do on this podcast from whatever platform you're listening to is super helpful, or just share it with somebody you know. If you have any questions, just message me through Instagram. That's where I'm most active. My handle is at Reika Yoga, ReikaYoga, or you can message me on my website, www.reikayoga.com. We'll be back next week with the third and final episode of this mini-series on sequencing with Karen. So I will speak to you next week. Bye.